Good evening and welcome to this session of Critical Motivation. Are you aware of the awesome power at your disposal? Your brain contains roughly 80 to 100 billion neurons, 100 to 1,000 quintillion, that's 10 to the 18 synapses. Information travels at an amazing 430 kilometers per hour. That's faster than a Formula One. It can change throughout your lifetime due to a property known as neuroplasticity. It can also continue to form new brain cells via a process known as neurogenesis. It's 30 times more powerful than the IBM Sequoia, one of the most powerful and fastest supercomputers in the world. And 1 second of brain activity is equivalent to 40 minutes of data crunching by a top supercomputer. Pretty impressive, huh? Critical motivation covers several subjects. Its objective is to help improve performance, achieve set goals, and be more successful, leading to a happier and more fulfilling life, both professionally and personally. We'll start with Mindpower. Why? Our brain is our most powerful weapon and often very underutilized. Like everything else in life, if it's not used, it deteriorates, and pretty quickly. Some of the ways that we can exercise the brain and use its awesome power are imagination, focus, perseverance, meditation, visualization, use of the subconscious, curiosity, awareness, and critical analysis. We'll talk about several of these in a minute. Why is it so important to exercise the brain? Or in the words of Arnold Palmer, one of the world's greatest golfers, certainly of all time, what separates great players from the good ones is not so much ability as brain power and emotional equilibrium. Visualization. Visualization is not new. Aristotle described the process over 2,000 years ago. How do we visualize? We visualize an activity, an event, a goal. We visualize with optimism, being positive, but always realistic and in great detail. Think about a chain of events and personality traits needed to achieve that goal. Many have used it and continue to use it. For example, Muhammad Ali used affirmation, visualization, mental rehearsal, self-confirmation, and perhaps the most powerful epigram of personal worth ever uttered, I am the greatest. Visualization has been proven by multiple scientific studies. Here are a few practical examples, personal ones. This is a squash ball, for those that haven't seen one before. I still play squash after many, many years. I used to compete many moons ago. At the local club when I play, there are about 6 to 10 players amongst the 70 or so that are in very, very good physical shape. They run marathons, triathlon, cycling, the 180 kilometre per day type, all about 20, 25 years younger than I am. One of them is, shall we say, a little special and has a rather creative interpretation of the rules, shall we say. He always stresses me out when we play. The first time we played, he won 3-2. The second time, 2-3. I ended up more tired than when I used to compete. Incredible. The third time we were about to play, I decided to use visualization, which I hadn't done in a long time. So a couple of days before the match, I started to imagine, visualize, go through the routines that we used to go through, practice all the trick shots in my head. Basically everything we used to train and do way back in the competition days. Also, before I went to bed, I thought about the match to let the subconscious do some work. And finally, when we played, the result was 11-0 in the first set. He didn't get a point till the second set, and the final result was 3-0. Business. In business, I've used visualization a lot, particularly for the critical objectives. Always realistic, always thinking of them in great detail, also thinking about what was required to achieve them, as well as the obstacles that could come up in the way of achieving those goals. And for those specific situations that were critical, like, for example, key meetings. Training others. My son-in-law had taken about 30 lessons, driving lessons, and in principle was ready for his test. He failed 3 times in a row. Before the 4th test, he asked me to give him a hand. So we had a 1-2 hour session, during which I concentrated only on awareness and visualization. He passed the 4th test without taking a single additional test. The process works, although it does take practice like everything else in life. Curiosity. Curiosity is that eternal human and animal desire to acquire information, knowledge, skills. We can be interested in many subjects on a personal level: history, culture, human development, etc. On a professional level, everything from technology, economy, psychology. Depending on our position and our industry, it may vary a little bit. Also sports, music, other activities. In a fast-changing world like ours, it is not only an advantage, it's a necessity. It also creates new opportunities for us and is useful and positive. Everything that is new creates more synapses and keeps those neurons firing. We need to exercise the brain continuously. In the words of Kofi Annan, knowledge is power, information is liberating, education is a premise of progress in every society, in every family. Awareness. What is it? Well, awareness is the ability to directly know and perceive, to feel, or to be cognizant of events. It's basically the state of being conscious of everything around us, both on a professional and personal level. Let's look at some examples of different perspectives of awareness. For example, the space-time continuum, to have a broader perspective of the world and life. Here we have the 2 axes of space-time, and in the middle you have the hypersurface of the present, so where we are today. Time, from the origin of the universe with the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, through to the creation of Earth, 4 billion years ago. The evolution of man in Africa, approximately 200,000 years ago, all the way through to our own lives. And space. Everything from the subatomic and atomic dimensions to our own world and our own dimensions, all the way through to the observable and known universe. It can be pretty humbling. It certainly puts us in our spot, right? Another perspective is the macro view, or the big picture. For example, we can use the PES concept to understand everything better. Politics, look at the economic aspects, socio-cultural, technological aspects, both on a global scale and country scale. Demographics, we can look at the environment, global trends, risks. Eventually they're going to affect us one way or another, so it's always good to know what's coming. The micro view, your immediate world, your industry, your market, both horizontal and vertical, your customers, their world, their markets, their customers, their problems. You can understand them better. Your products and services, how they differentiate versus competition. Competition, not just generic, non-generic, actual, future, etc. Suppliers, current, potential threats and opportunities. Current and future technology, for example. New business models, how can they affect us? And of course, our own personal world, what's important to you. Critical analysis. This is a result of my experience in security and intelligence. It's basically a combination of 2 different processes. The first process, intelligence analysis, is the process of collecting data and information to generate intelligence after careful evaluation and analysis, combined with critical thinking, which is basically the objective analysis and logical evaluation of an issue in order to reach a reasoned conclusion. Why is it important? The amount of information and data available today is mind-boggling and growing exponentially. There's about 16.3 zettabytes of information, that's 10 to the 21, on the web today. And it's expected to grow tenfold between now and 2025. Finding factual information is harder every day because the web is inundated with everything from fake news, post-truths, misleading information by businesses, marketing, interest groups, politicians, etc. This is not new. Manipulation, misinformation, and propaganda were used way back in ancient Greece and all the way through history to achieve all sorts of different goals and objectives. But we need to be able to answer our key questions and concerns, both professionally and personally, based on solid facts. So how do we get started? Well, let's look at an intelligence cycle and the key steps. We start with a purpose, a question, then we go through collection, evaluation and classification of what we've found, the analysis phase, and the conclusion. Let's start with the collection, the different sources of information we have. Human intelligence is basically what we know and what the people around us know on a professional and personal level. OSINT, open source intelligence, basically everything that's available publicly on the web and other media. CybInt, cyber intelligence. There are certain aspects of cyber intelligence we can get a hold of it, even without being experts, if we need to. GeoInt is geospatial intelligence, so basically location information. Let's look at one of the important sources of information, which is OSINT, and the different engines and info sites we have. The general search engines. There are only 4 that have their own motors. Ask, Bing, Google, and Yahoo. Every other search engine is based on one or a combination of these search engines. There are others that are topic-based or data type-based or based on semantics, etc. We'll go through a few of these that can be relevant to us. If we're interested in information about a company, there are a series of websites and search engines we can use to find it. Here are a few of them. Internet of Things. If we're interested in looking at connected devices to the web, everything from webcams, industrial controllers, fridges, etc., etc. Anything that's connected to the web, we can look at either locally, at a country level, or globally. If we're interested in not having any of our information that we're using to search on the web, we can use a couple of different search engines. I've named a couple of them here that do not record any search data. Genealogy, if we're interested in looking at people's family history. Specifically, if we're interested in looking for information on people, there are different search engines and directories and websites that we can use to find that. But one of the best sources is social media. It's a goldmine of information specifically for people, but also for certain topics, although we have to be careful because there's a lot of fake news and misinformation there as well. Dark web, I wouldn't recommend you go in there unless you know what you're doing and you have a specific reason. Maps to find geospatial information. And then we have discussion forums, chats, message boards, etc., etc., etc. By the way, search engines only find or can access about 20% of the information on the web. The next phases are evaluation, classifying, and analyzing information. There are some things we should bear in mind when we're looking at information and their sources. For example, is it relevant? Is it up to date? Is it recently published? Is it verifiable? Are the statements supported by credible sources? Is it unbiased or as unbiased as possible? Is it accurate? For example, sales increased by 2 million. That's a pretty vague statement. What does that represent in percentage of the total? Is the information and source credible, reliable, reputable? There are 2 types of information. Primary source, which is fundamentally first-hand, factual, and non-interpretive, and secondary sources of information, which is a result of analysis or interpretation, either of primary sources or primary and secondary sources. Classification. We can use many systems, but one of the simple ones, basically, we would classify the source, the reliability of the source, and the reliability of the information. We can use a system of 1 to 6, for example, for each one. And on a personal level, an example, when I was purchasing a home a few years back, I was looking at several apartments in an apartment block, and a couple of days after having seen one of them, the owner called me up and said they were interested in selling the next day because they needed cash very, very urgently. So that very night I started looking at information on the owners and the house, etc., because we were meeting with them in my lawyer's office the next morning. After a while, I found that the husband had been in prison, or apparently had been in prison, for fraud. Of course, that set off all sorts of alarms, and what looked like an opportunity, it looked more like a problem right now. After a few more hours of analysing and investigating, I finally found that there were 2 different people that had exactly the same name and exactly the same surnames. And I confirmed that because the photos were different, and actually the age was different as well. We finally bought the house without a problem. Let's look at a historical situation, Cuba, back in 1962, and the US intel community that was looking at a lot of information that was coming out of Cuba. Very mixed reports about Russians in Cuba and some other pieces. There were some pieces of information that were known. For example, it was confirmed that there were conventional Russian forces present. It was also confirmed that there was an air defense system, SA-2, being deployed. What was not known at the time was that the Russians were also deploying offensive nuclear weapons. Now, why were mistakes made? Fundamentally, because the human, up until that point, human intelligence that was coming out of Cuba was mostly false. So they assumed that the new information that was coming out was also false. The other mistake they made was they didn't take into account the global situation. For example, US had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey, which is a direct threat to USSR. Also, there were US troops stationed in Berlin. Castro regime felt threatened by the US because the Bay of Pigs had happened just the year before, and there were sanctions in place against Cuba as well. So both USSR and Cuba had many reasons to feel threatened by the US. The conclusion of the community, the intel community, was that the conventional Russian forces were there for defense purposes in case of a second invasion of Cuba. They did not ask a lot of the basic questions. For example, why was such a sophisticated anti-air defense system in place? What exactly was it protecting? They were very expensive, very sophisticated for the time. So there were a lot of errors committed. The result was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the closest the world has ever come to total nuclear annihilation. Certainly worth studying. So, where can we use critical analysis? Well, there are a couple of areas we can use it. Number one, on a professional level, we can use it to look at customers, markets, competitors, suppliers, partners, possible M&As, HR candidates, etc., etc., etc. Also products, services, new technologies. On a personal level, we can use it to look at any controversial subject of interest, important decisions we're going to make, like a home purchase, or key people, like the homeowner. Here's a series of questions we can ask ourselves, or to help ourselves analyze the situation. It's based on the 5 W's and H: who, what, where, when, why, and how. Who, for example, who benefits from this? What's the best, worst case scenario? Where would this be in the real world? When would this be a benefit to us? Why is this a problem or a challenge? How does this disrupt things? I won't go through the whole lot. But the idea is to get your brain to work. The objective of critical analysis is to avoid a crisis. And really, if you think that I'm being melodramatic, let's recall a few of the words and what happened to people in the past. For example, Blockbuster Video CEO in 2008 said, "Neither Redbox nor Netflix are even on our radar. They are now bankrupt. Digital equipment founder in 1977 said there is no reason anyone would have a computer at home. They are also now bankrupt. Microsoft's Steve Ballmer in 2005 prophetically said, Google is a house of cards. And recent industry disruptions include Apple iTunes in music, Amazon in distribution, Airbnb and home away, in hospitality, Uber and Cabify in the taxi business. Remember the words of George Santayana, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Therefore, make sure you use your brain.